Stranded, Chapter 4. Buzz couldn't believe what he had just seen. It all happened in a matter of seconds. One moment, Dexter was motioning him over to get into the life raft, and the next, he was just gone. Now the four kids were alone on the sinking boat, left to fend for themselves against the storm. Buzz stayed low in the cockpit, his arms threaded around the spokes of the captain's wheel. There was no trying to steer anymore. It was only a matter of holding on and trying not to get swept overboard himself. Heavy sea spray and driving rain smacked against his face as they crested another enormous swell. The entire boat seemed to stand on end for a moment, its bow pointed at the sky, and Buzz's stomach lurched wildly just before the hull slammed down hard on the other side. Keeping to a crouch, he looked around, trying to spot the others. Carter and Vanessa were at the front now, hanging on to the rails on either side. Hopefully they were both still clipped to their safety lines. But Jane? Where was Jane? Had she gone over like Dexter? Buzz scanned the dark ocean all around him, what he could see of it anyway. Even if he did spot her, he realized he'd never be able to save her now. Suddenly another loud cracking sound split the air. Not lightning this time, something even closer. And it wasn't until he looked straight up that he realized what it was. The 50-foot mast towering over his head had begun to sway like a tree about to come down in the storm. And if it did, it's going to fall right toward the two at the front. "Vanessa! Carter!" he screamed, but the wind seemed to whip the words right out of his mouth before they could do any good. Next came the sound of popping bolts, then the groan of metal buckling under its own weight as the mast started to fall. "Look out!" Buzz yelled as loudly as he could, but the storm was louder. Carter never even heard the mast coming until it crashed onto the deck just barely to his left. The impact sent him sprawling on his back again. Fiberglass tore like paper around him. Teakwood splintered and broke off at crazy angles. The mast itself dipped top first into the water and then slid right off the boat like a giant goalpost, taking the entire side railing with it. Before he could even try to move away from the edge of the deck, another wall of water slammed into the Lucky Star. It came from the left port this time, sending the boat heeling sharply onto its right side. Carter grabbed onto the only thing he had left, his safety line. As the boat tipped, gravity took hold, and his body pivoted toward the water. The mesh of the jackline dug hard into his palms, but it held him where he was. At the same moment, a scream came from across the deck. He looked up really, and he saw Vanessa tumbling free of her own line, straight toward him. With the railing gone, there was nothing to keep her from dropping right off the edge and into the water. Well, nothing but me, Carter thought, and strained to reach his hand out as far as he could. Vanessa felt a snap when her safety line gave way. She pinwheeled her arms to try and stop herself, but it was no good. Already she was falling sideways with the tilt of the boat. Her shoulder pounded hard against something. As the world turned upside down and over again in the dark, the only thing left to grab was Carter's hand. Vanessa reached for it as she went past, and for a moment they connected, but then her fingers slipped out of his. Her body flew across the last of the rain-slicked deck and out over the water. "No!" Just as quickly, she snapped back hard. The hood of her raincoat had caught on something, even as the waves below tried to swallow her up to the waist. "I've got you!" Carter yelled from behind. "Give me your hand!" Vanessa reached toward his voice, grasping blindly. She found his arm first and started to climb it like a rope, one hand over the other until she could swing a leg back up onto the deck. She pulled herself the rest of the way on board and collapsed there, catching her breath, while Carter clipped her onto his own line. "Don't move," he shouted, lying flat against the rocking deck of the boat. Vanessa caught sight of Jane huddled on the galley stairs. She was only a shadow in the dark from here, but the tiny size of her was unmistakable. "Jane!" she yelled. "Jane!" Jane barely moved at all. Her only response was to point back the other way, toward the front of the boat. When Vanessa turned to look, all she saw was a dark blur. But then, with the next flash of lightning, it became clear. The unmistakable jagged mounds of a rocky shoreline loomed straight ahead of them. "We're going to crash!" she screamed. Jane wedged her foot against the opposite wall of the stairwell and squeezed her eyes shut, unable to move or even to yell out. It was like the voice inside her head was trapped there, even as her mouth opened and closed. "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!" But this was no dream, and the crash came all too soon. With one last surge, a huge swell of water rose up under the boat, even as it sent the whole craft hurtling forward. Another unbearable sound of rock tearing at the hull came from below. Jane heard breaking, splintering sounds, and then nothing at all, as the force of the crash sent her tumbling back down into the galley. She felt herself turning over and over again as the water continued to flood into the boat. Then she slammed into something hard as everything came to a fast standstill. For several bewildering seconds, Jane swung her hands around, trying to find something to grab onto. She couldn't even tell which way was up, and a wave of panic threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, her feet found solid ground. She stood up quickly, grasping the water in the cabin. Gasping. The water in the cabin was now up to her chest. But where were the others? The boat had stopped moving, a bizarre feeling after the roller coaster of the storm, but the wind and rain and lightning were still raging outside as much as ever. She heard Carter first shouting her name in the dark. "Jane? Jane!" "I'm here," she screamed back and stumbled through the water until she hit the galley steps, just as Carter came down to get her. Vanessa and Buzz were right behind, just shadows in the dark now. "Are you hurt?" Carter asked. Jane had banged both her knees and her head, but nothing felt broken. When she tried to answer, all that came out was a choked sob. Carter pulled her closer and held on tight. "Hang on, Jane. Don't be afraid," he said. "I got you." "What do we do now?" Buzz shouted, but there was no answer for that either. The boat seemed to be lodged against whatever rocks they had landed on, and at least for the time being, everything beyond the edges of the deck was invisible in the dark, and the whole cabin down below was flooded. They were already doing the only thing that they could, huddling together on the stairs for warmth, keeping as much out of the storm as possible, and just waiting for it all to be over.